I promised you this morning that I would tell you this story, and I don't think a lot of people don't know this story in my life, but it's you want to talk about the universe being wild. I get goosebumps just thinking about it. So just so people understand this story, it started when I was young. So my family's from a town of like 400 people. It's in South Central Washington, middle of nowhere. I have 5 siblings. There's my 2 older brother and sister. They're full.
Right. And
then I was by myself. My mom was married to their dad, married to my dad. And then, the story with my dad was, homosexual. And I think he was. So I always have this weird thing where I tell people, like, if it was cool, if it was okay to be gay back then, I don't know if I ever would have existed. I still think about that, how lucky I am in reality to be here. Obviously I wouldn't have known if I was never here, but still. Right. And then there's my younger 3 siblings, and then that's my stepdad's kids.
Right.
And when we were young, I saw my real dad very rarely. And then my older brother and sister, they never saw their dad or anything. He was never a part of their life. And my stepdad had, married my mom, and they'd been married for, I got to think here, probably like 4 or 5 years. And he got a job down in Florida. And the route we took to Florida was, we took like a special route, and it was for him to finish the 50 states. And I'd see, if I'm 7 at that time, he probably was a little over 30. He was probably 31. And, he finished the 50 states. Well, I remember when I was young, I was like, I want to finish the 50 states. I thought that was cool.
Yeah.
And really cool. And so we'd moved to Florida, and then my stepdad's parents lived up in Delaware. So we would go up and down the coast. And so we started hitting these states, and we'd do some stuff. And then, fast forward quite a few years, we'd made a trip back. We'd moved back to Washington, and then we went a different route. We went a different route back home. So I'd hit a bunch of states that way. And we'd normally do national parks and kind of cool things like that. And then I didn't travel very much for a while until I was in high school. I went down to California, so I got to knock that one off the list. And then, then I got into college, and then I had my daughter, and I was like, well, I need to start making money. So I dropped out of college, and I got into wind energy, and I travel around building wind turbines all over the country. And so over the next, being in wind for as long as I got to travel all over the country. And I ended up finishing the Continental 48 before I was 25. And and this is like not just flying in. This is going around, sitting down at a bar, having a beer with a local resident, and trying to learn the culture. And I loved people. So I finished the Continental 48 before I was 25. And then a few years later, I was like, I'm going to finish the 50 states before I'm 30. I was like, I can do it. And so like a few years later, I was tired of wind energy. Turbines were catching on fire. And I was like, this is a job that only gets harder. And people are like, you should do sales. So I got into this sales where we would do home energy efficiency packages, where we would, insulate with like MLI in your attic and then your crawl space. And if you did it in the thing, it said you could go to Alaska. And I was like, I got to do Alaska.
Oh, yeah.
Why don't I give it a shot? So I hounded the guy, and I got into that job, and I did fairly well at it. And the way we would market is you would send out mailers, right? They would pick a demographic, send out mailers, then you'd get invited to a dinner, and then they would give you a presentation at the restaurant or whatever. And then I would go run the bid. You could give them a card back with your name and your address and your phone number, and then a time for the appointment.
Yeah.
And so, it's a game of chance that, you're playing obviously with marketing. And so I did well. I get to go up to Alaska, and we're like on the 3rd or 4th day there. We did Anchorage the first few days, and then the next day we went over to Wasilla, Alaska. And so at this time, I'm probably 28 years old. I can't remember exactly. So I did 49. The 49th state was my 49th state. And so I'm excited just to be there and doing this and running around trying to make money. It was the second day in Wasilla, Alaska. So I was already running bids from the first dinner. And so I'd been out running around, and then they did a lunch that day. And then I get a picture of a card, and it says, Jim Green, whatever, Wasilla, Alaska. And I'm like, okay, just look at it real quick. And I punch it in. I'm like, yeah, I can make it there. I got time. So I go over to this guy's house and I knock on the door. Dogs start going wild, and he had one of those doors where it has the vertical window next to the door.
Yep.
And they were healer dogs that came up and ran. I could see them, a blue and a red healer, and they were going nuts. And I was like, hey, there's healer dogs, cattle dogs out here in the middle of the woods in Alaska. I was like, that's kind of funny. So the guy comes to the door and he introduces him. He's like, hey, I'm Jim. I'm like, hey, Jim, I'm David. Nice to meet you. He's like, hey, I heard you wanted a bid, and and he starts talking, real friendly guy. And he starts talking. He's like, yeah, I know this stuff works because I know technology, I know how, it reflects heat, the certain energy waves of heat, it reflects out. So he's like, yeah, I know that because it's the same type of stuff they use in car engine cabins, and they put it above the transmission to keep the heat from coming into the cabin of your car. And so I'm like, oh yeah, where do you work? What do you do? And he's talking. He's like, I work at the VA center, and I drive an hour and a half to work every day. I work 4 days a week. I had today off because I was, he had to help his wife with something. And so he's just chatting it up. So I go up into his attic, and then I use like a laser measure, and I measure the attic, and then we come down out of the attic and we're just visiting, and then we go down into your crawl space. And in Alaska, the crawl spaces are deep. Let's say like 4 feet deep. Let's say this one was maybe a little bit more, and it's because they want to keep the ground they have like permafrost is really cold, so they want to keep the pipes away from the ground, and then they don't insulate the ground because they want the heat from the house to go down into it, so it doesn't freeze the pipes. So in Alaska, we would insulate the walls of the foundation, and then we would do the floor to reflect the heat back up into the house.
They didn't have cellars or basements like here?
This house didn't. Maybe they do at some, but they would store stuff in there too, a lot of people in the winter, or just in general. So, I'm sitting, crouched down, like you can picture me crouched down like a catcher, and he's, from me to you. And he asked me, I'm from me to you, and we'll say in catcher's position.
Yeah.
Lights on, and I'm looking at him face to face because it's very tight quarters, and he's like, how would you do it? And I was like, before I'd answer that, I was like, because I'm not a salesman really, I do it off of honesty, and I was like, I'd have to tell you where I probably come from or the type of life I've lived, for you to respect my answer. And I said, I grew up in a small town. My family had a farm and a logging company, and my grandparents always kind of said, the way you treat your stuff is like, it's a sign of respect to other people and yourself. That's what I took out of it. Like we would always have to dress nice, even if we went to lunch in the town that we lived in. Right. My grandma, if we, in the middle of work, my grandpa would like to take her to lunch. Sometimes it was really fun, but we'd go wash up, we go wash up. Yeah. And because you're going into somebody's business, you are an advocate for their business, and you should be respectful and look nice. And he's like, yeah, I kind of lived in the same type of area. And I'm like, or environment. I'm like, oh, really? I was like, where at? And he's like, do you know the Yakima, Washington area? And I'm like, yeah. And I looked at him. I'm like, I'm from Glenwood, which is it's across Mount Adams from Glenwood. And he looks at me, man, it's going to make me emotional. He looks at me and he says, I'm from Glenwood. And
you're both from the same town?
I pictured it. I looked at his card.
Yeah.
His name was Jim Green.
Yeah.
My older brother, who's 7 years older.
Yeah.
His birth name is James Green. He was my brother and sister's dad.
Are you kidding me?
No.
Whoa.
Face to face in a crawl space in Alaska, all because I made this decision when I was 7 years old that I wanted to finish the 50 states.
What are the chances of that happening?
Yeah. It's weird because I still get really my arms kind of went numb, and I swear I could see the blood leave his face.
Wow.
And a tear rolled down his face. I pointed at him just like this. I was like, you're my brother and sister's dad.
Wow.
Yeah. And what's wild
that is amazing.
Yeah. You want to talk about the universe? I would always say my last name because I'm really proud of my grandparents and my family. I would almost always say my last name when I introduced myself.
Right.
For some reason I didn't. And I always believed that was whatever was going on in the universe was to make that moment a story and impactful to people. Yeah. And I lost it, man. And he talked like my brother. Him and my brother talk the same. He kind of looks like him. Very nice. And then there's a lot more to the story, but this podcast is about you. But I promised you I would tell you that story.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And I think it's
I'm
important
glad
for people to
you told me
understand.
That's a trip.
Oh yeah, it changed my life. It changed my life. I
Yeah.
thought you never know what's around the
What
corner.
are the chances of that happening?
In a crawl space
Yeah.
that is at his home in Alaska.
Wow.
You have to think of all the things that had to come together for
Yeah.
that, between, you know, however much life.
Or just to get there from here all the way to Alaska, then you're in this guy's house.
Yeah.
And then besides that, it's even deeper. You're in a little crawl space
Yeah.
right next
Very
to
intimate.
each other.
Very intimate face to face. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's still, that story hits me, and it's hit a lot of people over the years.
That is a trip.
Yeah. But yeah, we wanted to talk about that because you
Yeah.
and I kind of have a very similar belief about faith and the universe.